crediting programs already offer well-established and trusted monitoring and reporting verification, or MRV for short, for cooperation or mitigation activities under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And of course, we're also facing in a world of capacity challenges, funding constraint, and growing urgency for effective tools of mitigation. So we want to present on how we could leverage this and move the Article 6 implementation forward. So this event is co-organized by Singapore National Climate Change Secretariat, together with Verra and Gold Standard. Hugh is online. And today we also have colleagues from Ghana and GGGI, Daniel and Fenella joining us today. So before I start, I will run through the program briefly. So it will start off with a context setter, which is going to be by me on the policy and infrastructure hurdles for the use of independent carbon crediting mechanism under Article 6. Then followed by Andrew from Verra on streamlining the interoperability of independent carbon crediting programs and national Article 6 infrastructure. Before we move on to panel discussion, which will be moderated by Fenella from GGGI, and with the rest of us, Daniel, Andrew, myself, and Hugh online from Gold Standard. And then we can end off with a Q&A. Yeah, so for a start, I will give a context setter here before I pass it over to Andrew. Yeah, so I will present on the policy and infrastructure hurdle for the use of independent carbon crediting mechanism under Article 6. Yeah, so as everyone will have known is that Article 6.2 provides a decentralized framework for voluntary bilateral or plurilateral cooperation between countries. And this allowed countries to leverage Article 6.2 to guide the generation and transfer of carbon credits with corresponding adjustment. In the Article 6 room, we term it as IPMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And host country can authorize these IPMOs for different users. For one is NDC use, which could be for the participating countries in the cooperative approach, or other international mitigation purposes, which include voluntary use by corporates for their corporate climate target or compliance under CORSIA. And in the future, we believe that there will be other international mitigation purposes coming out. So IPMOs can also be cancelled for overall mitigation of global emissions, or OMGE, which is essentially a kind of contribution to the Mother Earth to reduce the overall global emission, or be channeled for monetization for adaptation actions, which in Article 6.2, 6.4, we call it SOP. And given the decentralized nature of Article 6.2 cooperation, countries can actually enter into different models of cooperative approaches. So broadly at a high level, they may include establishing a national carbon crediting program and standards. This could be like perhaps Thailand through the TGO, or leveraging existing independent carbon crediting programs and standards, which is like what Singapore is doing with our partner host countries. And lastly is setting up ETS link, emission trading system links. So this provides for various models as allowed under the Article 6.2. So focusing on one cooperative approach model, which is to leverage independent carbon crediting programs or standards. In short, I will call it programs here, as not all countries intend to set out their own crediting and trading mechanism for Article 6 cooperation. As you already know that setting out a new standard is not that easy. You need to put in years and months of hard work and resources. And this, using the carbon crediting programs, this allowed them to use something that is already readily available in the voluntary market of VCM. So this will allow them to reduce the time, the cost required to start reaping the benefits of Article 6 cooperation as soon as possible, while at the same time helping to advance global climate action and ambition. As non-state actors, such as companies, ecosystem players, are already familiar with VCM mechanism and instruments, they will also be more willing and ready to participate in and support Article 6 cooperation by leveraging carbon crediting programs and standards that are already in the market. And many credible programs and standards already have robust governance system and requirements for MRV and environmental integrity. This is seen by the various standards and programs undergoing the robust evaluation by CORSIA, ICAO CORSIA, and likewise the soon to come ICVCM CCP. So there's already credible programs and standards out there. But ultimately it's up to the countries and the cooperative approach to determine whether these programs and standards can generate carbon credits that meet their environmental integrity requirements. So putting into perspective, it is something like what Singapore has done. We are going to raise our carbon tax next year to Singapore dollar $25 per ton, with a view of ending off with $50 to $80 per ton, which translates to about 65 US dollar per ton in 2030. And at the same time, we are putting in place the international carbon credit framework that allows companies to offset up to 5% of their taxable emissions with such Article 6 units from our partner host countries. And we actually put in place the requirements to screen the environmental integrity of the various programs and methodologies. So this is one example of how countries can be in control of the environmental integrity requirement. So to advance this model, we definitely need to align existing VCM mechanisms to Article 6 requirements. Most of the requirements are already sound and already in the Article 6 rulebook that was adopted in Glasgow and further refined in Sharm, and hopefully at this COP we will have further clarity. So modification will definitely have to be made to this infrastructure and processes to actually align with the requirements under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Some of the processes include authorization, tracking, accounting, reporting, and common nomenclature. This will be also part of the host country requirements to participate in Article 6. As every program and standards, likewise for countries, have different existing national processes and infrastructure, bespoke arrangement will be required for operationalization. However, such bespoke arrangement will not be helpful because this increases the risk of monopoly and exclusivity by a few programs and standards. We raise the barrier of entry as time and resources needed to set up bespoke arrangements. And lastly, it reduces the participation of countries if this is really complex. As you know, VCM or carbon markets is not something that is easily understood, and there are many moving parts going on that require both policies and infrastructure to address. So therefore, there's a need to have some form of standardization to maximize participation and reduce the barrier of participation. We foresee that this will also encourage innovation and competition to continuously improve the building blocks of the standardizations. And this will provide the signposts for countries when setting out their national carbon markets framework. Many countries are starting at different starting point. So having some form of standardization, it helps them to get into the program, get them into the Article 6 cooperation faster and with a clearer view, instead of going round and round through many detours and not able to achieve the intended outcomes. So standardization needs to be able to address key and infrastructural hurdles to operationalize this. So for policy hurdles, as we all know, countries will definitely have different national processes, requirements such as laws, policies, as well as institutional arrangements. In some countries, it might be the Ministry of Environment. In some countries, it might be the Ministry of Trade taking the lead. So to operationalize the following, which include authorization of IPMOs, which definitely you need documentation, DNAs, eligible activities, and environmental integrity requirements. And likewise, we also need to put in place IPMO tracking and reporting requirements, which touch on the institutional arrangement and having the forms and templates ready. And moreover, through a cooperative approach, you require the cooperation of two countries. It actually, for a single host country, you have to partner with several partner countries. This increases the complexity if there's no standardization. So this actually helps to resolve some of the key issues. And for infrastructural hurdles, countries will have different registry arrangements as well, transaction models for tracking and reporting. For example, some countries might prefer distinct transactional and IPMO registry layers. Some countries might prefer the use of international registry provided for by the UNFCCC in the future. And some might rely solely on registries provided by programs and standards. Given the difference between countries, the standardization could be in the form of building blocks of requirements, which can be deployed as required. And this will also guide the countries to implement their Article 6 cooperation model more effectively and more efficiently. Yeah. So I have provided a context sector, so I will pass it on to Andrew that will talk about what is essential for interoperability.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Verra. I think it's a great entrance point into this discussion. I think from Verra, we're very keen to highlight the fact that the crediting program that we run, and the same goes for Hugh and Gold Standard Online, these are programs which have been going for over a decade now, almost 2 decades. We've already got a lot of experience behind us. The whole movement towards greater and greater integrity over time is a journey that we are continuously on, constantly revising methodologies and improving the standards and improving the processes. So I think there's a lot of value there, and it can really help to kickstart Article 6. I think here in what we're talking about, we are a long way from the political discussions going on over in the B1 area. What we're trying to be here is very pragmatic, very practical, and so I'm going to talk about interoperability. I'm going to talk about standard operating procedures. I'm going to talk about how you can actually connect up our systems, connect up our infrastructure, so that everyone's got the kind of information they need at the right time. And it's all to facilitate countries in being able to do more Article 6 activities and be able to do them faster. So, yeah, that's what we're talking about here. I want to say a few words at the beginning about what we mean when we say interoperability. And you might, I don't know if you recognize the kind of graphic on the left. It's a process map. It's each box represents a task. One task comes after another. There's different actors involved. So we are really trying to be very practical about how this can work. For us, the interoperability in the Article 6 context is about tying together the requirements and the procedures which a host country might set out. So we're also going to talk about buyer countries, but a lot of this will have to do with host countries. So what are the requirements and the procedures, and very often the legislation and the frameworks that they have, and how can that tie into the project cycles that we run? So all of our registration and MRV is based on a project cycle, and how can these systems connect? And the goal that we have is to come up with a common operational procedure, not just for Verra and not just for Gold Standard, but for any independent crediting program that wants to use it. And it would clarify a number of things. It would be consistent about the terms which are being used, about the definitions underpinning those terms, what sort of information gets exchanged between the two programs or two registries, what sort of process steps should there be, what responsibilities does each partner have within this process, and very importantly, what the timeline expectations are. So for us, this is about efficiency, and it's about actually making use of the opportunity that we have with the crediting programs that we already have available. Let me just talk a little bit more about the functions themselves. So in terms of the crediting programs, and this is probably a good moment to say we tend to call ourselves independent crediting programs. We don't call ourselves voluntary carbon market programs, and that's because our credits are already being supplied into compliance markets. So it's not the case that these are only for the voluntary market. These programs are already available in a compliance market sense, and actually are already being used in an Article 6 sense as well, because there's already authorizations which are being received for the credits that we're issuing. So on the independent crediting program side, obviously a lot of what we're doing is registering projects and then going through all of the monitoring and the reporting and the verification. That gives the actual carbon credits, which are certainly until now, those credits have been issued on our registry directly, and then they're held in accounts by project proponents and perhaps by other buyers of the projects. So that is all managed within our system, within our Verra registry in our case. One of the features where I think we're really just beginning is to help host countries have more oversight over the activities which are going on in their countries. So the voluntary market has, until now, been quite absent of government partners. And I think we're beginning to see that now, obviously because of the Paris Agreement and the NDCs. All of the emissions are the responsibility of the countries, so our countries are getting much more engaged. We see that as a good thing, and we're keen to enable countries to be able to have oversight of the projects which are happening on their territory. And of course, the accounting that countries need to do under Article 6, under their NDCs, that's something that we can support by giving information. On the countryside, and as I said, I'm talking mostly about host countryside, but investor countries are sometimes also involved in that, and I'll speak to those as well. They're in the process mostly of still developing Article 6 strategies, so they're working out how they can do activities under Article 6, how they can get finance through Article 6 channels. So they have an opportunity to then set guidance for what projects and what entities should be doing through our independent crediting programs. That oversight is very key. That oversight will mean for many countries that they actually want to have an approval step within the process, or at least a no objection step, so that they have some control about what's happening. And of course, the accounting for Article 6 and NDC achievement is going to be very key. So what does that mean in terms of what sort of information needs to flow back and forth? So the list that we've got here is divided into what independent crediting programs will need to provide, and also what national registries, particularly of host countries, would need to provide back to us in order to make all this work. And I'm not going to go through all this. I think it's fairly straightforward. Obviously, on the independent crediting program side, the information on the projects and the entities that are involved with the projects all needs sharing. Very often, where a country has specific requirements for what a project should be, whether it's about the sector it should be in or about sustainable development priorities it should be pursuing, these are things which we can actually also check for, and we can actually confirm back to the host country that these country-specific requirements are being met. Once we register a project, we need to be able to tell the country that. We need to tell them what reductions are being achieved, what credits are being issued. Then you get down to really practical things. Serial numbers, we need to be sharing the serial numbers. And when a transfer is made, the country needs to know about this. Ultimately, if you're familiar with Article 6 discussions, there's a first transfer condition which is met at some point. So this could be the first international transfer, or it could be the issuance of a credit. When whatever that trigger is, whatever that condition is, and there is some flexibility as to what countries can choose, once that condition is triggered, then we can inform the country, and that's when the obligation to do the corresponding adjustment kicks in. From the National Registry back to us, what information do they need to give back to us? Very often that'll be around saying what are their priority sectors. If there's guidance which says we want to have projects in this sector or in this particular technology type, then that's guidance that we can take on, and that would inform the registration process that we make. Article 6 authorization will be very key. We do that already. We've both Gold Standard and we've set up our processes for receiving letters of authorization. That then results in us putting labels to indicate the Article 6 authorization directly on the credits within our registries, so that when buyers come searching for credits, they can see what's been authorized and what hasn't. We're going to have to marry the system of unique identification for the ITMO, the Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes in Article 6 parlance. We need to marry that with the credit serial numbers, so we've got traceability between the ITMO and the credit. And I'll talk in just a moment about the kind of levels of accounting that we have. And when a country does its corresponding adjustment, we need to know about that as well, and we'll flag that within our registry. So this is again, being very practical, it's information which all of us need to share. It can be done through push and pull systems. We can do it through email, or we can do it through API linkages between registries, so in order to automate everything. All of these things are possible. Technically, it's actually quite easy, but what we need to do is get clarity on what it is that should be exchanged. Just a few words on different registry types. So what's happening right now is the projects are being done, they're registered within our registry, the MRV is conducted, the results come into our registry, the credits are issued, the credits are retired. It's all within our registries at the moment, whether that's Verra or Gold Standard. And this is very much about the transaction layer, is what we're calling it. The transaction layer is about the credit, it's about management of credits, and it's to be distinguished from what's happening at the country level. And so here in yellow, basically yellow, if you haven't picked it up, is whenever it's about the country or about a national registry. So there needs to be this information exchange, and in terms of Article 6, the primary role of a registry is to sort the accounting so it's about ITMOs and accounting for ITMOs, and this is what feeds directly into its NDC accounting. So this is an accounting layer, and it needs to be tied to the transactional layer of credits, but it is distinguishable. Now, you will see that some countries will be implementing a crediting program of their own, and they may put a transactional credit system into the same registry as the accounting layer. So sometimes you can have the same system which caters to both needs, but what I want to distinguish here is these are the different sort of functional areas of the different types of registries. And I think that's important when you look at the buyer side as well. So, you know, Singapore on my left here, so they have a carbon tax system. As of next year, the Verra credits, Gold Standard credits, can go into the carbon tax system. So what happens there is the entities which are covered by the carbon tax, they're able to surrender credits which have been generated by us, and these credits then reduce the carbon tax liability. So I think the way that's going to happen is they'll be retired within our systems, but we need then to communicate with the carbon tax system in Singapore in order to say that a credit has been retired for this reason. And once the mitigation impact is sort of owned by Singapore in the sense, then it'll be used by Singapore towards its NDC. So there again, you need the connection between what's happening at a transactional layer on the carbon tax and the accounting layer of the national registry. So, you know, this is kind of how all the registries play together. It's how they connect, and there needs to be different information exchange for different parts of this chain. I'll say a few words on the requirements. When you look at the requirements which are geared towards doing this interoperability, most of them are quite common to both a national registry and a carbon crediting program registry like ours. What's going to be very key is a universal communication protocol. And again, I'm being very practical. Many years ago, I used to work for the UN, and we hooked up all of the Kyoto registries together with the International Transaction Log. This was done through a data exchange standard. I don't expect that this one is going to be quite as extensive as that one, but essentially, it's a protocol which defines how the systems speak to each other and what sort of information to exchange and how is that information formatted and what's the medium for the communication. So that's going to be key. And our expectation is that if we can get a few countries and crediting programs working on this, then people will see the benefit, and then it'll start to spread. Because when it works, you know, people will like it and start to use it. That communication protocol ensures data consistency, it avoids double counting, and it's done through practical things of standardizing terms and definitions and process steps. Both the national registries and the crediting programs need to record these letters of authorization and all the statuses of the ITMOs. We need to have a universal numbering system. We don't expect to have to change the serial numbers that we're using for credits, but we do need a way of being able to relate our credits on our registry to another registry or to an ITMO. And we just need to have a numbering system which can kind of form the core into which all of us will be able to map our serial numbers into. And then the generation of transparency reports and supporting countries with their reporting. On the crediting program side, there are a few extra things. Obviously, there's the management of projects and MRV and credits. And as I mentioned before, there's the labeling of our credits with Article 6 authorization labels. And on the national registry side, there are some things which are unique there as well, in particular around the link to an emissions registry, because that registry will be many times the home for checking whether the emissions are higher or lower than the NDC targets. And of course, reporting into the UNFCCC on the results. Last slide here. I guess this is a caveat to all of this in the sense of saying standardization is helpful, but at the same time, countries will have sometimes unique processes, and whatever standardized operating procedure we put in place needs to respect the fact that different countries are sometimes going to have different needs. And I put here a few of the examples of where you might have differences. Just to speak to a few of them, different countries are going to have different approaches to whether they actually want to approve projects or they wish to have a non-objection process, or maybe they don't want to have any say in the matter. The difference between non-objection and approval is that non-objection is you have a certain amount of time for the country to raise objections. If they don't, it can move ahead. That can sometimes be more efficient than actually requiring a country to take a positive decision of approving a project. But different countries will take different approaches. In terms of the authorization itself, this is very much the prerogative of countries. They have the right to say how many projects and credits they wish to see associated with CORSIA use, for example. CORSIA is something which requires authorization, or how are the credits to be used within NDC uses by other countries. In terms of the use against voluntary targets which are put in place by corporates, countries have a choice, the host countries have a choice whether they wish to put it into the authorization framework at all, or whether they're actually happy with no authorization and no corresponding adjustments done for that voluntary use of the credits. So there's inherent flexibility built into this. Some countries will want to find an investor party up the front and have a bilateral agreement and have that already there before projects are even registered. Other countries will be happy to see projects being registered and then to incorporate them into a cooperative approach at a later point. We're likely to also see countries having different approaches to authorization limits. Some countries will, and in fact they're already choosing to withhold a portion of the credits for their own purposes. We're also seeing countries who are talking about using these OMGE and SOP, the overall mitigation in global emissions, which is the 6.4 idea, came originally from the CDM, and the share of proceeds for adaptation. So there may be some application of these concepts within our processes as well. Either the same formulations which have been created under the UN, or some countries are looking at different formulations of OMG and different shares of proceeds. So this is really just a reminder that we need to build the system to be able to respect what different countries are doing. So that's what I wanted to say, and that's hopefully a good introduction to, as I say, the practical ways of being able to connect our systems.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So yeah, so today we have a panel here that will be moderated by Fenella, who is from GGGI, Global Green Growth Institute. And we also have Daniel Benefoh from the Environmental Protection Agency of Ghana, who is also the national focal point, or the designated national authority for carbon trading in Ghana. And joining, other than Andrew and myself, we also have Hugh Salway from Gold Standard joining us virtually. I'm not sure how we will project him on the screen, so we will need the technician to help us on this. Yeah, so I will hand it over to Fenella to help to moderate this session. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we ask if the IT guys are able to get Hugh up in Technicolor on a screen somewhere? Please. Don't know if it works. Secondly, I'll try Hugh. Are you out there? There he is.
I'm here. Can you?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome, Hugh,
Great.
from, I presume, London or Paris? I don't know where you are today.
From London. From London.
Right, welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Fenella Aouane. For those of you like sitting in the air-conditioned, cool and dark, you'll notice that I've decided to make this my home for the afternoon. And I head carbon pricing at GGGI, which is an international organization focused on technical assistance. So we're trying to do the things, some of the things that have been described and are being looked at for standardization. And I will immediately come out and say that's a great idea, because host country governments don't want to be doing lots of different things for different people. However, you are getting right to the edge of my knowledge field when you're talking about the nitty-gritty of passing transfers. So watch out, audience. I've spotted a couple of you who I definitely know may know more than I do. I'm looking at Johnson and Ingo, so I may well be coming to you for comments and thoughts on this. But first of all, let me just go to Hugh and Daniel, and just following those presentations, what's your approaches, and how as a host country, do you think you've set up and matched this? So I think, first of all, Hugh, can I just understand, and can we help the audience understand, you know, you're kind of the second independent standard on the panel, so how coordinated are you with Verra? How standardized are you? Do your serial numbers match, for example? So if you can elaborate a little and help us understand before we then take that to the host country. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fenella. And hello, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but my name's Hugh Salway. I'm Director for Market Development and Partnerships at Gold Standard. And I mean, we started speaking to Verra about this question around a year ago, because there are some areas where, as standards and kind of different players in the market, it makes sense to do things yourself and to take a differentiated approach. There are other areas where the market really needs standardization. And it felt to us around a year ago that if you look at how Article 6 is going to be implemented, there was and there still remains a real risk that we do see different approaches in countries and across standards in how some of the basic operational pieces work. So what exists in different registries, how to communicate between different registries, the nature of what a government does versus what a crediting program does. And it's not helpful to scaling up the use of carbon markets and the use of Article 6 if we do have these different approaches across governments. There are some areas where each of us will want to make sure that we are running systems in a way that kind of meets our own circumstances. So for governments, they will have their own adaptations on what's needed for using Article 6 in the way that Andrew said at the end. But I think what we're talking about here is making sure that the basic plumbing, the basic engineering which sits behind Article 6 is standardized, and that can help project developers when they're looking to develop projects under Article 6. It can help governments when they're looking at what is quite a complicated space and what are quite a complicated set of rules, and they're trying to work out how they can use this in a way that is efficient. And it can help us as crediting programs when we're looking to set up systems that can help kind of dozens of countries across the world to use Article 6 well. And so I think we're starting at the right time to think about how to make sure we set up Article 6 systems within standards like Gold Standard and Verra that can support Article 6 well. We do have some governments which have already started to come forward with Article 6 frameworks, but we're still quite early on in that process. And so now really does seem to be the right time to be thinking about what standardization looks like. So if you have a letter of authorization under Article 6, which is given to a project under Gold Standard or under Verra, what does it look like on the back end to make sure that that information is kind of reflected in our registry well, is then reflected back to the country's registry. So I think those are the main things I would say now at this point. I'm kind of really pleased that we've been able to work so far with Singapore and Verra to start to think about what a standardized process looks like. There's a lot more work that we need to do now to flesh out a playbook, an operational procedure for how this can work well in practice. And we also need to work more broadly as an international community on this question of what actually happens in practice when a credit gets authorized under an independent standard. How does that work in practice afterwards? What information is passed between registries? And so we hope that some of the discussions that we've been having so far get broadened out quite significantly over the next year or so that we can have a more common understanding of how this should work.
Thank you, Hugh. And we'll certainly come back on many of those points. I think just maybe a little bit, because I don't know how, you never know, you sit in these rooms and there's a sea of people in front of you sort of behind the glaring lights, and it's like, okay, so you're all experts in registries, or you're not, and you just came in to enjoy the air conditioning while looking at your phone. I don't know. But certainly I'm not. So I'm going to just lay it out a little bit for those in the room who want a little bit of explanation from what I understand, and then I want a little bit of comeback from Daniel and others as to, is that right? So previously under CDM, if we were looking at trading what was as near as we can get it to what we would now refer to as a compliance unit, a CER, you were only dealing with one standard. You were going to the UN, you were going to the CDM, you were registering a project, and there was sort of one place for it to go. Now we have the beauty, I feel, of Article 6.2. So you've now widened the number of methodologies that you could use from just a UN system, which the mechanism will be under 6.4, as they've said, and they plan to have that issued this year, next year, depending on how it goes in B1. But now you can use other standards, as I think you very rightly say, Andrew, independent standards. So I can register under the Gold Standard or under Verra, and that does not necessarily mean I've done a voluntary credit. It means I've generated a credit that, if it has a corresponding adjustment, is an ITMO. So the problem you've got now is, what do I do with kind of like all of my things that are in different rooms, and how do I coordinate them? And it's then how do I feed that in and out of a national registry? And then, don't forget, no less, I mean, we're speaking here about independent registries, but Article 6.2, I could just sit there as a country and agree with another country to do a trade, and I don't have to have any standard at all, as long as I'm complying with high integrity. So that, where do I put that one? So I think the standardization of what happens is really a very interesting point, and where we come from is we're trying to help countries set up these, as they've been referred to, frameworks of what do the templates and the bits of paper look like that they have to fill in. And it would be jolly useful if there aren't 24 different versions that you have to fill in for every different standard that you have. So extremely timely. So on that note, First of all, have I got that right, Andrew? Ish?
Yeah, I think you have. Certainly the transition that we've all gone through is from a very singular KP world, curated protocol world, where certainly in the crediting space you had CERs. You did actually have JI as well, joint implementation. You remember that one? Yeah.
All right.
It is much more diverse now. These independent crediting programs grew up in parallel to the curated protocol and parallel to the CDM. So they've been operating for around the same period of time, but they've been, until now, very much in a voluntary parallel universe to what the CDM was doing. And now everything is very much joined up. And I think that's a healthy thing for the market. I think it's healthy for mitigation, for climate action. And there is, to a degree, there's kind of competition, if you like, healthy competition, I think, between the standards. But I think coming from my economics background, I think that's actually key to making sure that we do have progression and we allow for innovation. And I think it's really good for climate action to have access to so many different programs. There is so much to do that I don't think any of us are concerned about not having enough of a piece of the pie. It's not like that at all. There's just enormous amounts of more mitigation that need to be done.
Okay, so on that note, as you say, there's an enormous amount to do. There's an enormous amount of opportunity open to you. However, if you're a host country, and this is where I'll turn to Daniel, there's an enormous amount you have to do whether you like it or not in order to be able to issue an ITMO. So how the heck are you going to, how are we going to teach all the potential host countries? How are we going to try and make it simple? What are you doing? What have you found so far?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, I think we should begin to picture this as a marriage between two consenting adults, right? And that is what exactly is the effort to democratize carbon markets. In that the rules are determined by two consenting spouses, right? And these are the participating parties, right? So I think that's a very important point. But the same Article 2, 6.123, apart from providing the framework to have that marriage established, also provided the elements or the features of a good marriage, right? That is, it ought to promote ambition of the NDCs, right? It promotes the ambition of the once you begin to or decide to marry, it ought to promote the ambition of the marriage, right? That is the cooperative approach. It ought to promote environmental integrity. It ought to promote sustainable development. It ought to meet the requirement of a robust accounting system. You ought to authorize it. So these are the features of a democratized carbon market arrangement between two parties. So that's the first point. The second point is that how then do you do it among yourselves, these two parties? And one bit of it is about the choices that you make. And one of it is the choice of adhering to high environmental integrity principles. And that comes in a very handy way, in a sense that once you have multiple cooperative arrangements, the requirements are a bit different in practice. And let me give you one example. Ghana is in a situation where we are likely to be engaged with 4 or 5 cooperative approaches. All right. One of the cooperative approaches will require us to select or use standards that are agreed over and above the existing standards. That is, when I say standards, I mean the use of the choice of an independent crediting scheme and their standards, their methodologies, their registries, and other rates. That choice would have to be made between two parties. And there's another one too that we are involved in where the other party has decided to let or use the independent registry systems to run it. So we need to meet the requirements of Ghana and another party where we have our own standards that we use over and above what exists already, and the one that is to use what has been described already. So as a host party, we must have a system that will respond to those two requirements. And that is very important. But it's also clear that countries like us don't have national systems that are matured and transparent and has the confidence as they have it in the independent crediting programs. And therefore, we have decided to provide options. All right. So we have the first option where the entire spectrum of ensuring high standard and high environmental integrity and MRV is defined among the participating parties. For example, the relationship between Ghana and the Switzerland government, those elements are defined by us, and we don't rely on any third party or any independent crediting mechanism. So we define our own standards, we define our own way of issuances and all those things between us. That relationship is quite daunting because there's so much work to be done among ourselves. Then between Ghana and Singapore, it's likely that this model will come in since we don't have our own system of approving standards or using registry systems. We need to rely on the ones that are already there, and therefore then comes in this. So in our national framework, there is the option 1, the option 2, and the option 3. The option 1 where everything is done between Ghana and the Swiss government, and then the option 2 where we devolve or we decentralize those functions to an international crediting program, do it on behalf of us, and thirdly, ensuring that all of these are linked together in the national registry systems. So the functions of registries, standards, crediting systems is such that if you decide to participate in this voluntarily, you must provide the options. And that for us is very, very important. And because this is supposed to be ensure that there is flexibility, we do not want to marry ourselves to a particular standard. That the program developers must have the freedom to choose, but at the same time, in choosing, you must be mindful about the basic requirements that are needed. And that is the beauty of the creation of Article 6.2 about the marriage between two consenting adults. Right. So that's how we see this. So the bottom line is that if you decide to participate in this, colleagues, you need to be prepared. You are transferring the duties to the country to the extent that you have to ensure that all the qualities of the marriage is met, and at the same time provide the options for this in the country. That is our approach.
Super. Thank you, Daniel. And it's so interesting. It's so nice to get, and this is what we've done, rather than this is what we're planning on doing, to get what has happened so far. I'm going to bring in another analogy here, because you're very good at the analogies on consenting adults and ITMO babies. So my one is about, so Article 6 rule book is the guide, the North Star. Everyone's following that. And the standards are checking that their methodologies follow high integrity, are following the setting of baselines, proving additionality. I don't think that's wildly different from the CDM. I will have a question a little bit later about how far a standard will be proving an activity is aligned with a country's NDC, because isn't that actually the host country's right to say, if you've got a letter of authorization, that's it. The country has decided that that's okay. So I think maybe I have a question about that. Why is that in there? But my analogy is my daughter has very, very long hair. And when you brush it, when she was little, it kind of was okay at the beginning, and it kind of, you were going fine, and then there was this huge great knot at the end, and that was always the sort of painful bit that you had to unknot. And I'm finding what you're calling the transaction layer and accounting layer, the actual numbers and how you put the trade and where you put the trade and how you show the trade and the transfer, that seems to be the most challenging in my mind. We're getting a lot of countries asking, we want a national registry. But I don't think, how does that work? They still have to sort out and coordinate with a lot of other places. And what? They write their own registry, it's on an Excel spreadsheet, they buy in market or another party. That's where I'm a little bit I'd like to understand that a little bit more. So maybe if I pose that question to Hugh, perhaps online, and to Andrew and see, and then get a reflection back from Ruyan, and then we may go to the audience. So, Hugh.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really helpful to hear the perspective which Daniel just shared as well from Ghana, because, sorry, I can hear myself back a little bit, which is distracting. But I think this points really to what we're talking about here, that there are different options which you have to have when you're using Article 6, because for Ghana, you're working with different cooperative approaches. But if you work with a standard, whether that's Gold Standard or Verra or Article 6.4, the hope is that the processes aren't the same behind that. So you're not managing kind of multiple different ways in which this works between these different standards, but you have a common single approach for how information gets transferred between the two registries, how you interact with those registries. And I think that's what we're really interested in here, having that common approach. And on what you were just saying there, Fenella, I think that's exactly right. And I guess the practical question for us is, as standards, we're now receiving letters of authorization from some governments. So some governments are interested in moving forward. They are authorizing units issued to projects registered with our standards. But there are still some open questions about what happens on the back end then. So it's not completely clear from the Article 6 rulebook, and there are some divergent views across countries about what is the nature of what exists in our registry. How does information get passed to the national registry? How do we work with administrators of those national registries to make sure that countries have all the information which they need to report to the UNFCCC, to make sure we're not in an instance where we have double counting, confusion over what exists where. And all of these kind of back end, kind of boring questions are really needed to make Article 6 work. And so a lot of what we're talking about here isn't the more glamorous kind of big numbers and kind of impact level of Article 6. It's more, how do you keep the engines running behind the scenes in a way that makes Article 6 work well? And how do you make sure you're not building 100 different engines, but you have one common approach which works across different standards and across different countries? And I'm not sure that we're going to get into this level in kind of international rules at Article 6. What we need in practice is instead to have something which gets adopted amongst different countries and standards, which kind of standardizes this approach of how you actually do this. And so, yeah, I mean, for us, I think this is the main focus, the kind of very simple, basic, what happens in a registry, how does that registry connect to another one? This is really one of the key questions that we need to make Article 6 work in practice. Now we're at the point where countries are starting to provide authorizations. So this is the main focus for us. And I think you're right, this is, in a way, the kind of knot at the bottom of the hair. Things can kind of flow well, but if we don't have this resolved, we could face challenges later on.
Great, thank you for that. And just to remind us all, this kind of, if there was only one system within the UN, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's because we've opened the flexibility of 6.2. We need to be thinking outside of what guidance we're going to be given. We kind of got to do it ourselves a little bit. So, Andrew, and then I'll come, if someone can pass the roving mic to the guy who's got his hand up just there. because I think that would be some great insight.
Yeah, just picking up first of all on your last point there. I mean, the kinds of connections that we're talking about are not unique. You know, they're needed within the UN system as well. And you know, I was in the room yesterday where Article 6 is being negotiated, and you know, there's a discussion there about what sort of linkage should there be between the credits which get generated by the Article 6.4 mechanism, and should these be transferable into the international registry, which is, you know, the registry being set up by the UNFCCC Secretariat for those countries that don't want to create a registry of their own. And you know, there's a big discussion there, largely a political discussion and a discussion around funding and this sort of thing. And you know, the result is that there won't be a connection between the two. So I think what we're trying to do is cut ourselves away from a really political context, and we're just trying to say, okay, there are some practical considerations, there are some technical things that need to be done, and we want to get on and do them, essentially. On your point about the transactional layer, I think, just thinking about the marriage of consenting adults again, I think the other two things that we're marrying here to some degree are the way that governments work with Article 6 and the way that governments have priorities for projects and mitigation, and the way that the market works in order to mobilize finance. And when a credit is generated through a project which has gone on in Ghana, for example, then that credit can go into a marketplace which is all geared towards being able to provide finance back to that project. So the credit will seek out buyers on the market. Sometimes it'll be included in a forward contract which is exchanged somewhere else. The credit still remains on our registry, but the buying and selling of that is subject to what is done by market players outside. And all of that is geared, from a policy perspective, all of that is geared to providing finance from private sector back into that project in Ghana. And you know, the credit itself will have, to some degree, a life of its own. It'll operate on a registry, it'll be featured within the market, it'll generate finance. And what's important from the Article 6 perspective is we know at what points to capture information and feed that into the accounting system. And there's only a few things. We need to know that the credit has been issued. We need to know when this first transfer condition has been triggered. So that's either going to be the authorization of a credit, or it's going to be the issuance of the credit, or the international transfer of a credit, or the retirement of a credit. These are things which have been defined within the Article 6 rules. And that information will need to go up to the National Registry. And you know, what you see on the diagram, which is still up on the screen here, the yellow National Registry, that will have connections out to many different registries. It's like Daniel was just describing. Some of what Ghana is doing is creating a bilateral arrangement with Singapore, and some of it is working in the context of arrangements with Singapore. It's using mechanisms like Verra, like Gold Standard, and I think there's 5 or 6 different crediting programs in the system, so it's not just us. And you know, we need to be able to identify those moments where information needs to be fed back into the National Registry from whatever transactional registry is being employed within the financing that's occurring for the project.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the audience for one particular comment. Ingo, I will introduce you. Ingo Poole is one of the founders of South Pole, who have been working on the first authorized and pending transfer credits. I'll let you define that more clearly, from Thailand. So you're in the middle of the knot. What's happening?
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm speaking today as just an expert. We've made the recent experience that talking too much is not good. So it's a private statement. And I want to say, actually, as plain as simple as I can, what I think this is. The independent carbon standards were created to manage the use of carbon markets for the ambition of the private sector in their net zero commitments. We are creating the Article 6 infrastructure to manage the use of carbon markets for governments in the management of their NDCs, of their ambition system. We have two ambition systems that stood next to each other. What your initiative is bringing this together under one infrastructure, which as a side effect makes a tremendous contribution to integrity. Because all of a sudden, the actions of the private sector within the net zero commitments becomes part of the jurisdictional world of governments, which is exactly the jurisdictional and the judicial protection that the independent carbon standards and private sector acting in that market need. In my view, I have been to COP1. I have been around for a very long time. This is COP28. Irrespective of the outcome on Article 6 negotiations, this is the most important initiative on markets, literally in the history of the carbon market ever. This is how big this is, in my view, because it brings it together in this world. I have had the pleasure of moderating a session at New York Climate Week with all carbon standards, all CORSIA accredited carbon standards present, that led to a joint statement that was published 5 days ago here at COP and had very positive media response, also as a contribution to integrity. So this is coming together. And the analogy is, when we talk about children, it's been almost like 18, 20 years. This is, basically children coming to maturity, becoming adults, and walking on their own legs as their own independent person. So I think it took us the lifetime of a person to reach this level of maturity. And I did not know this was coming, but this is what this means to me. Basically the beginning of a very mature, very integrated carbon market. Thank you.
And what are you doing in Thailand?
Well, in Thailand, we are trying to walk the talk. So in Thailand, there's a framework, and it is unfortunately that it's me, some white guy, talking about what Thailand is doing. The best that I can do is wear a jacket from northern Thailand. But my friends from Thailand, they are, let's say, very modest. They don't like to talk too much, but they like to do. And this is what Thailand has been doing now for 5 years, building the infrastructure emerging for a truly integrated carbon market that brings together a domestic carbon market. Thailand has its own carbon standard, a national carbon standard, managed by this very cool organization, Thailand Greenhouse Gas Organization. I would really recognize the colleagues from TGO, who have created the regulation for the authorization of international transfers under Article 6.2. And they have created a framework for the use of carbon credits for independent use under net zero commitments. That's a blueprint for first for Thailand, but I think actually for the world, on how to create these interoperational standards. And I would hope that Thailand will embrace and participate in this, what you are doing going forward.
Thank you very much, Ingo. I mean, I have to say, I will confess, we had the pleasure of Pawina on the previous panel from TGO, who was explaining, if we talk about that accounting there, that what they're having to do between TIVAs, the voluntary credits, is they're literally having to add more fields to make the number longer, because the two of what an ITMO number is, a serial number, and what a TIVA's serial number is different. Perhaps I can turn, Rian, to you for thoughts from, we've got an idea of this is a good initiative and it should be done. I must admit, I'm interested to see, if we do this, is this also actually going to force the buyers to start conforming and doing the same thing, rather than having different approaches and saying that Ghana has to take several different approaches?
Yeah, thank you very much. So on the first point, I think what essentially this model brings about is flexibility while achieving the objective of scaling up carbon markets and scaling up mitigation activities, as well as safeguarding integrity in terms of consistency, in terms of meeting Article 6 requirements. So we have some form of standardization across different carbon crediting programs, which is important. Otherwise, everyone will be doing their own things and we can't track them. And it is precisely why Singapore supported the Climate Action Data Trust, which is a public infrastructure that helped to harmonize the data for climate carbon markets. So building on the point that Ingo made, as well as your question, which is we need to move away from the dichotomy of voluntary markets and compliance markets, because no one is stopping you from using Article 6 compliant carbon credits or correspondingly adjusted carbon credits for your own voluntary use. Essentially, this is just an attribute. There's no need to differentiate that, oh, I'm using this for compliance, that's why I don't use it for my own voluntary use. Essentially, this is going to be a sustainability calculus, a form of CSR, as well as a form of responsibility to the global commons, to actually think about whether to start using correspondingly adjusted carbon credits, and not just for compliance sake. So in some sense, what we are trying to do here is also, the scaling up is that many of the voluntary carbon markets players, the companies, the entities, they are all very familiar with the voluntary carbon markets. And it's quite impossible, I won't say it's impossible, I would say it's quite impossible for countries that are not very versed in the field of carbon markets to set out something that is brand new and expect it to scale all the way to the full potential at the short term. That's why we intended to start up this whole initiative using the carbon crediting standards and work with those that are credible, accredited by CORSIA, which is a kind of a stamp of approval. So in some sense, this allowed the companies to come in quickly to scale the carbon finance needed to scale carbon climate action. So this is precisely why we decided to work on this. So in terms of the next steps, it's really not just between us, Verra, Singapore, and Gold Standard. We intend to work with ecosystem players, other carbon crediting programs that leverages on the press release that the various standards have 5 days ago precisely, and also with the host countries that like Ghana, Chile, and various countries out there to actually to operationalize this, to scale the carbon markets in a credible way that is aligned to Article 6 and the Paris Agreement goals. Yeah, I will stop here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rian. Okay, I have a couple more questions. Right. So every potential host country that we speak to that says, I need technical assistance, I don't know what I'm doing. Also, we need a national registry, make a national registry. And I'm like, I've seen some experiences of people having very expensive, lavish national registries built using donor funding, and it's great. No, they get a perfect registry. The problem is that the following year, there's a maintenance fee from the independent software provider, and they go around the donor community again and they say, well, can someone pay for our maintenance fee? And all the donors go, no, 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 we're only here to do something new. We're not here to, we won't get the glory for that because the other donor that put it in will get the glory. We don't want, so nobody wants to pay the maintenance fee. So a poor nameless country spent a good few years setting up a registry, and now it's totally defunct because they haven't been paying the maintenance fee. So my question is, if we still need to have a national registry in all the countries, what's the best and most efficient way to do it? Maybe if I start with Daniel, I'm going to ask all of you.
At least the country is on Ghana, right?
Yeah, no, sorry. You're all right. It's another continent.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the Article 6 arrangement is quite forward-looking. It provides the the need for participating parties to have access to registries. And the spirit behind that is that the participating parties would have, it didn't mention a particular type of registry. It said you have access to it. So it could be you having your own national registry, or use the international registry systems, or use an independent registry. That is our interpretation. And therefore, each one of them would have to play a very unique function. And I like the idea of separating the transactional functionality of the independent registry systems operation, and then how it is linked to the accounting functionality of the national registry systems, and then the international one. The issue is that we have decided to use a very simplified, less complicated, open keeping, bookkeeping arrangement, and also open softwares to have our own national registry systems for two reasons. The fact that we don't have enough transactions occurring in the country because we are beginning, and therefore we have least or low maintenance costs. But at the same time, we do so with a view that we could progressively enhance the functionality of the national system that we have. And that, in our view, is a good way to start, because then you not only are you able to start by meeting the participation requirements, but at the same time thinking about how to connect with others. And that is what how we are approaching this. And in a sense that we don't think that having a sophisticated national register system is a requirement for you to participate in Article 6.2 or in Article 6. In our view, what you need is a minimal requirement that will allow you to perform those accounting functionalities as is required by the Article 6. And very importantly is also the fact that many countries do not appreciate the fact that you don't need to have this complex arrangement in place because it costs money. And you need to have a sustainable financial flows to be able to maintain that complex system. So why don't you, again, work with others to scale that type of functionality? Because then it works very well when you have a minimalist approach and have a system that can function and work with others so that you can meet those requirements. So our approach is that use a least cost approach, meet those requirements, and ensure that you have a progressive approach to increasing the functionality of the national system that you have in place in the country. And leave the issues of unique serial numbering, the issue of issuance, the issue of transfers to somebody else to do, and do what you can do best. And that is our approach.
Okay, so that's great, because that divides the how many have I sold against the how do I make sure that it's proper and it's real and it's been issued, etc., which is the transactional list. So next to you, maybe Andrew, and then to Hugh.
Yeah, I think the distinction is really, really important to make, and I would very much echo what Daniel's saying. I go a little further, well, maybe in very simplistic terms, and say that the transactional layer is the hard one. That's where you've got to keep track of every single individual credit, and there are millions of them, billions, in fact, and all of the project and all of the MRV, the whole project cycle, all of the data that generates. Once you've actually got the credit issued, then it's also a huge security issue, and where I think we're taking the registry services is something which is on par with financial systems. That's the kind of security that we need within the system. And I think a transactional registry is really challenging. when you compare the accounting layer to that, it's actually really simple. You know, you don't have to track every single movement of a credit. What you need is the reflection back into the National Registry of what the accounting implications of that are. And you'll have some countries that honestly could quite feasibly do this on an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not advocating that, but I think it could be done without too much difficulty. And I think that's, if you think about the challenges and the capacity issues that many, many countries are facing, we need to make this distinction of transactional and accounting. And if a country is able to do a transactional registry, then great. But if they're not, or if they have other priorities for all that money and expense, then that is something which can be outsourced to someone else who's doing this work already and already has systems in place.
Thank you. I smile a lot then because I do happen to know one Northern European country who did run their registry, their national registry on an Excel spreadsheet for about 10 years. They'll remain nameless. Hugh, over to you. And okay, I don't get it then. I'm sorry, I'm being very dumb today, but I think this is a very important area to make really clear for everyone so that those who aren't familiar understand the importance of it. So there's going to be an international registry available for countries who haven't got their own. How does that come in, and what function does that hold between the transaction layer and the accounting layer, or are they just saying you can share an Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, I mean, so just starting with the building on the points that were just made earlier. I mean, so I felt exactly the same worry a few years ago when I kind of heard of private registry services which were available to countries which cost several £100,000 or dollars a year to maintain, and it just didn't feel like that was necessary at the time for the level of kind of use of Article 6 that some countries would have. And on our side in Gold Standard, we're kind of building a system that would work if a country was just using Excel right now at the first. We're making no expectations of the types of systems that countries will have in place initially. And the reporting which we would do could kind of flow into a Excel spreadsheet for accounting purposes. But ultimately, there is a vision that you can get in the future to a place where we have more established registries which are integrated through something like the CAD Trust, where we have information flowing from the registries of our standards through to national registries, and you have this kind of integrated system. And so that's not where we need to start, because we're starting from a very basic standpoint where countries will only be looking to authorize a few projects at first, but we know where we want to build to in the future. And I mean, for us, we've been thinking a lot more about national registries at the moment, and how we would connect our standard through to national registries. But I think the same principles would apply for international ones as well, for the international one. And I think, again, it comes back to the same important point that we were saying earlier. What I think is fundamentally important is to separate out and to clearly distinguish between the role which we as standards can play, which is managing kind of transactional information about credits, and the role that governments play, whether that's on national registries or the international registry, which is more of the accounting sort of function and accounting towards their NDC. And separating out what we do in registries in that way doesn't just kind of ease how we manage our registries and kind of clarify the roles there, but it also just reflects the roles which we each have as organizations. It's the national role to decide what to authorize and then to account towards NDCs. And it's our role as standards to manage these credits, these assets within our registry, to manage the transactions of them, to make sure there's no double counting, there's clear ownership. And I think the same principle applies there, whether you're talking about national registries or the international one. I think it becomes a little bit more difficult for the international registry because that requires us to work with and have agreement not only with governments, with parties, but also to have a relationship with the UNFCCC, which I think some more work needs to be done on.
Very diplomatically put. Singapore, can you explain how CAD Trust comes in here without using the word meta?
All right, I will try. I mean, CAD Trust is a global data layer that helps to connects the various registries, be it national, the ITMO layer, the transactional layers. So this actually gives the flexibilities of CAD Trust, the potential to scale up in the future to be the interoperability hub, to help to push and pull the data and to mirror the data between the transactional registry as well as the ITMO layer registry. So it has that potential, but I'm not committing on behalf of CAD Trust, even though we have 3 council members here. But I'm not going to commit CAD Trust to this, but this is something that is worth exploring as we progress on these partnerships, not just between Gold Standard, Verra, and Singapore, but together with the host countries, together with all the other registries and standards out there. Then that's where the CAD Trust could potentially play a role. Of course, this is something that we have to discuss further. But most importantly is for us to work on the standardization building blocks, and slowly from there we can identify what is the technological solutions that we need, and then we can assess how CAD Trust will come in. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Rian. Right. Now you've had it all explained to you, loud and clear. I'm going to turn to all of you and ask for questions from the audience. And please, as complex or as simple, you have the bank of experts here. So there are any questions for any of our panelists? Yep, there's one at the end. We have the 2 ends, so the microphone holder's going to have to do a bit of a jog.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of ITMO.com. We're actually going to be issuing the world's first sovereign ITMOs in the next few months. So I'm happy to see that you've done a bit of your homework. There's a few flaws, and I'm happy to share notes with you, because we've actually built the back-end infrastructure, the tech infrastructure, to allow sovereign nations to issue and structure the right ITMOs in the right way, and then sell them on and distribute them on to the capital markets or to investors or to big corporates or to actually other governments. So I wanted to go back to your point, Fenella, because nobody answered it, and that has to do with the netting part. So how do you plan to net those projects at national level from the voluntary carbon markets? Because at the moment, as you know, you cannot issue ITMOs unless there are actual reductions or removals. So unless you do that in the first place, then you won't be able to authorize the issuance of an ITMO. So once again, how do you plan to net these projects at national level in the countries NDC? Thank you very much.
Thank you. If we can take one more question, and I'll pass the question to all members of the audience, the panel.
Thank you. John McGarity with Quantum Commodity Intelligence. Just got a question about the companies that provide services to build registries or run them. Is there a different model that could be used that avoids some of the problems that that were mentioned there about having to pay fees every year? And I'm just wondering which countries or organizations are stumping up the cash already, and which other organizations might be in line to do so. Thank you.
Okay, so is there a different model than having to buy a private sector registry? Okay, perfect. Is there a third one in the room? And then we'll get the right in the middle here, sir. Whoops.
Hi there, Mark Tilley here from Carbon Pulse. I was just wanting to ask a question in relation to the implementation agreement Singapore has signed between with Papua New Guinea. I was hoping to get an answer just on where voluntary standards could potentially act as to build capacity within jurisdictions that potentially have challenging governance environments, and how does that work going forward?
Okay, perfect. So effectively, can the standards actually offer some technical assistance to countries that are having some challenges around implementation. Okay, so who on the panel would like to start with the issuing of an ITMO and how do you net ITMOs at national level? Daniel, maybe.
Thank you. So, I mean, from our side, we have what we called an ambition spectrum, which is authorizing ITMOs within the NDCs and outside the NDCs, and within the NDCs authorizing over and above what we call the conditional NDCs, which is ITMOs that are unlikely to be realized without support from the carbon market, because then okay, yes. So that is what we meant by ambition beyond the unconditional NDCs, and the ones that are outside the NDCs are the ones that are authorized outside the NDCs, but also covered in the national inventories, and that is the spectrum of where we want to net the ITMOs that we authorize for transfers.
Yes, so sorry, everybody. Everything had been starting on the quarter hour, so I assumed we had until 1:45, and I've noticed we're going to get kicked out in about a minute. So maybe on any other views on that one, Andrew or Rian? No? Hugh? Okay, on to the further question around different models to purchasing a registry. Maybe Rian, if you take that one.
Yeah, I think there are different models out there. We know that there are organizations like UNDP, World Bank already providing for open source registry. But of course, the difficulty is how do you take over a registry and customize it to your own needs. And there are also registry providing, selling you as a product, and there are also subscription as a service. So there are various ways out there and various business and fee structures. So I mean, as we standardize a lot of things, we foresee that the cost will actually drop because of economy of scale. Yeah, I will stop here.
Fantastic. And then lastly to Hugh and Andrew, the Carbon Pulse question regarding, countries that are maybe challenged, don't understand, is there a possibility of assistance? So maybe Andrew first, then Hugh.
I think actually what we've been talking about here is hopefully a very practical assistance to countries. A lot of countries are really struggling with how they can interface with Article 6 and how they can interface with the kind of carbon finance which is available. And I think what we're suggesting is to be able to come forward with this procedure, or whatever we call it, a playbook, which then says to countries, look, this is a good example of how it can work, and there will be some flexibility there, but this is a good example of how it can work, and and we'll be ready to work with countries in order to be able to implement that.
Great. And very briefly, Hugh?
No, I know we're out of time. There's not much more to add to that. I agree with what Andrew said. I suppose the one other thing is, I mean, as standards, we're kind of growing in size, but we still remain relatively small. And so I think finding solutions like this, where we're trying to standardize approaches, is one way in which we can help countries. There's some work which we can do with countries who are in bilateral agreements, like the ones with Singapore. But then also, I think there's a really important role that we can play working with development partners with more reach, whether it's the World Bank, UNDP, GGGI, or others, where we can bring the work and expertise that we have as standards, but work with others which have more reach and have presence in countries where we may not.
Thank you very much, Hugh. And I'm sorry to have kept everyone a couple of minutes longer. I think I'll just finish that point by saying, yes, it is the responsibility of organizations like ourselves at GGGI, UNDP, World Bank, PMI, and others